My name is Claire, and for 6 years I sat through every family dinner absorbing insults from my sister-in-law, Denise, without ever once losing my composure. Denise had built her entire identity around being the smart one in the family, the successful one, the one who married well and worked her way into a director position at a mid-sized logistics company outside Columbus, Ohio. She never let anyone forget it. Every holiday came with a fresh reminder of how far she had climbed and how little the rest of us had accomplished by comparison. I worked in operations consulting, a career she dismissed as glorified spreadsheet babysitting, and no matter how many times I tried to explain what I actually did, she would wave her hand and change the subject back to herself. It had not always been this way between us. When Mark first introduced me to his family, Denise had actually been friendly, almost welcoming in the way people are when they do not yet see you as competition. That changed somewhere around the 3rd year of our marriage, right around the time Denise received her first promotion at Halloran Freight Solutions. She started measuring every conversation in terms of who had accomplished more, who earned more, who mattered more within the family hierarchy. My quieter, less flashy career gave her an easy target, and she took full advantage of it at every gathering, every birthday, every casual Sunday dinner where the topic of work happened to come up. Mark had apologized for his sister's behavior more times than I could count over the years. He would squeeze my hand under tables, mutter apologies in the car on the way home, and occasionally try to confront her directly, only to be met with the same dismissive wave she gave everyone who challenged her. His parents, Susan and Richard, were kind people who preferred peace over confrontation, which meant Denise's comments rarely faced any real pushback at family gatherings. I had learned, over time, to let the comments slide off me, to smile politely and redirect the conversation, because making a scene never felt worth the fallout it would create for Mark and his family. That particular Thanksgiving, my husband Mark and I arrived at his parents' house in Dublin, Ohio around 2 in the afternoon, carrying 2 pies and a tray of roasted vegetables I had spent all morning preparing. The house smelled like sage and roasted turkey, and for a moment I let myself believe the day might go smoothly. Denise was already there, holding court in the kitchen, telling anyone who would listen about the promotion she was expecting by the new year. Her husband, Tom, Mark's older brother, nodded along the way he always did, like a man who had long since stopped having opinions of his own. I had actually been looking forward to this particular holiday more than usual, because just 3 weeks earlier, my consulting firm had landed its biggest client yet, a mid-sized logistics company undergoing a major operational review. The engagement was significant enough that I had been placed as lead consultant on the project, overseeing a team of 4 analysts and reporting directly to the executive board. I had not mentioned any of this to Mark's family yet, partly because confidentiality clauses restricted what I could share about the client, and partly because I had grown so accustomed to keeping my professional life private around Denise that silence had simply become habit. Dinner started pleasantly enough. My mother-in-law, Susan, said grace, and everyone dug into the food with the kind of enthusiasm only a holiday meal can produce. Richard carved the turkey with his usual theatrical flourish, and for a while, the conversation stayed comfortably on safe topics: the weather turning colder, a cousin's upcoming wedding, Susan's new garden beds she planned for spring. It was somewhere between the turkey and the sweet potato casserole that Denise decided to make her move. She turned to me with that syrupy smile she always used right before saying something cruel, and asked how my little consulting gig was going, as if I were still doing part-time work out of a garage. I told her business was actually going quite well, that I had recently taken on a new client, and was leading a fairly significant project. She laughed, not unkindly at first, but then let the comment land with real edge. She said it must be nice to call something a career when it was really just freelancing for whoever would return your calls. A few people at the table chuckled nervously, the way people do when they are not sure whether something was meant as a joke or an insult, and are hoping it might somehow be both. The table went quiet the way tables do when everyone senses a storm but pretends not to. Mark reached for my hand under the table, a silent signal that he was ready to step in if I needed him to. I did not take it. I simply smiled and said that every job looked small from the outside until you understood what it actually involved. Denise was not satisfied with that. She pressed further, saying she had built her career from nothing, working nights and weekends, while some people got by coasting on a few client emails a week. She said this while cutting her turkey with a precision that suggested she had rehearsed the whole speech in the car. Tom, sensing the tension rising, tried to change the subject by asking Richard about his fantasy football league, but Denise was not finished. She turned back to me and added, almost as an afterthought, that she supposed not everyone was cut out for real corporate pressure, and that some people were better suited for smaller, softer kinds of work. Susan shot her daughter-in-law a warning look from across the table, but Denise either did not notice or did not care. I could have ended it there. I could have laughed it off the way I always did, let her have her small victory, and moved on to dessert. But something about the practiced cruelty of it, the way she said it in front of his entire family, like she was performing for an audience, made me decide that this would be the last Thanksgiving I spent shrinking myself to keep the peace. So I asked her, quite calmly, what company she worked for. She blinked, surprised by the question, then answered with a note of pride, Halloran Freight Solutions, a regional logistics firm that had grown significantly over the past few years. I nodded and asked what her title was. Senior Operations Director, she said, straightening in her chair as though the words alone should end the conversation. I took a slow sip of water before I answered. I told her that name sounded familiar because my firm had just been brought in last month to consult on restructuring their West Region Operations Division, the division she managed. The room went silent in a completely different way this time. Denise's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She asked, in a voice noticeably thinner than before, what exactly that meant. I explained, gently, that as part of the engagement, my team had been asked to evaluate leadership performance across several departments and that I was scheduled to present findings and recommendations to the executive board in early December. Her face went the color of the mashed potatoes in front of her. Tom asked, half laughing, whether I was joking, the kind of nervous laugh people use when they're hoping desperately that something is not true. I told him I was not in the habit of joking about client work, especially work involving a company owned in part by people sitting at this very table. Denise's mother, who had been quietly eating at the far end of the table, looked up sharply. Apparently, she had not realized that her daughter's employer was the same firm being restructured by outside consultants, and certainly had not realized that the consultant in question was her own daughter-in-law. Denise tried to recover, saying there must be some mistake, that surely a project of that scope would have been mentioned to her directly. I told her that confidentiality agreements prevented me from discussing details with staff until the formal presentation, which was standard practice for engagements like this, especially ones involving evaluations of specific departments. I added, almost as an afterthought, that one of the items under review was whether certain department leads had been meeting performance benchmarks set at the start of the fiscal year. Denise's hand, holding her wine glass, trembled slightly as she set it down. Susan, clearly trying to defuse the tension building over her dinner table, suggested we save business talk for another day and pass the rolls instead. I agreed pleasantly and let the conversation move on to safer topics, though the air in the room had shifted permanently. Denise picked at her food for the rest of the meal, offering none of her usual commentary, while Tom kept glancing at her with an expression somewhere between confusion and concern. Mark squeezed my hand under the table, and this time I squeezed back. Dessert passed in a strange, muted quiet. Denise, who normally dominated every conversation at the table, said barely a word as Susan served pie and Richard poured coffee. She kept glancing at me across the table, as if trying to reassess someone she thought she had fully understood years ago. I made polite conversation with Richard about his garden plans and complimented Susan on the pie crust, letting the awkwardness settle without drawing further attention to it. After dinner, while the others gathered in the living room for coffee and pie, Denise found me alone in the kitchen rinsing dishes. She asked, quietly this time, without any trace of her earlier superiority, whether what I said at the table was true. I told her every word of it was true, that my firm had signed the contract 3 weeks earlier, and that I had specifically been assigned to her division because of my background in supply chain operations. She asked if there was anything she could do to improve her position before the review. I told her the same thing I would tell any client, that the evaluation would be based on documented performance metrics, team feedback, and operational outcomes, not personal relationships, and that the process would be entirely professional regardless of any history between us. She stood there for a long moment, clearly working through the reality that the sister-in-law she had spent years dismissing now held real influence over her professional future. She asked, almost in a whisper, if I planned to bring up tonight's conversation in my report. I told her honestly that I did not mix personal matters with professional evaluations, and that her team's performance would be assessed on its own merits, nothing more and nothing less. Relief flickered across her face, followed quickly by something that looked like shame. She lingered by the sink for a moment longer, drying a dish that was already dry, before quietly thanking me and returning to the living room. The weeks that followed were noticeably different. Mark mentioned that Denise had called their mother twice, asking cautious questions about the family, clearly trying to gauge how much I had shared and how the rest of the family viewed the situation. Susan, for her part, seemed almost relieved that someone had finally stood up to Denise's years of condescension, though she was careful not to say so directly. At the office, the project moved forward as scheduled. My team spent the following 2 weeks deep in Halloran's operational data, reviewing turnaround times, shipment accuracy rates, and staff retention numbers across all 4 regional divisions. Denise's division, the West Region Operations team, showed troubling patterns. Missed delivery windows had crept up steadily over the past year, employee turnover was nearly double the company average, and 2 major clients had filed formal complaints about delayed shipments. None of this was personal. It was simply what the numbers showed, month after month, spreadsheet after spreadsheet. I made a point of running the analysis exactly as I would for any client, cross-checking every figure with my team before drawing conclusions, and scheduling a call with Denise's direct supervisor to verify context around any anomalies. Professionalism mattered more to me in this project than in almost any other I had worked on, precisely because of the personal history involved. I was not going to let anyone, including Denise herself, question the integrity of my findings. The presentation took place on the second Tuesday of December in a glass-walled conference room on the top floor of Halloran's regional headquarters. I walked the executive board through operational inefficiencies across several divisions, praised the departments that were exceeding targets, and outlined specific recommendations for the departments that were falling short. Denise's division showed measurable gaps in process efficiency and turnaround time compared to her peers, gaps that had apparently gone unaddressed for over a year despite repeated internal flags. I presented the data as objectively as I would for any client, focusing entirely on systems and outcomes rather than individuals. Denise sat near the back of the room during the presentation, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching slide after slide of data that painted an uncomfortable picture of her leadership over the past fiscal year. She did not interrupt, did not argue, did not attempt to defend herself in front of the board. Afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, she approached me briefly and asked, in a voice stripped of all its usual bravado, whether the recommendations I had outlined were fixable. I told her they were, that every gap I identified came with a corresponding action plan, and that plenty of leaders had turned around similar numbers with focused effort. She nodded slowly, thanked me, and walked away without another word. The following Thanksgiving looked entirely different. Denise arrived without her usual air of superiority, greeted me warmly, and asked genuine questions about my work instead of dismissing it. Over dinner, she mentioned, somewhat sheepishly, that the improvement plan had actually helped her identify blind spots in her management style, and that her division's numbers had improved significantly since the changes were implemented. She thanked me, in front of the whole family, for handling the situation with more professionalism than she had shown her over the years. Susan smiled quietly from the head of the table, and Mark reached for my hand again, this time simply to hold it. Later that evening, as the family settled into the living room with coffee and quiet conversation, Denise sat beside me for the first time in years without an agenda, without a comparison waiting in the wings. She asked what other kinds of projects I had worked on, genuinely curious this time, and listened as I described the different industries my firm had helped over the years. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, like watching a door quietly open after being shut for a very long time. I never set out to humble Denise. I only answered her questions honestly when she finally asked the right ones. It turned out that the career she mocked as small was the very thing that ended up shaping the future of her own. And sometimes, the loudest people at the table are the ones with the least idea of who they are actually talking to.